Good evening. Welcome to the Chatham-Marconi Maritime Center Speaker Series. My name is Liz McCart, and I'm a volunteer here. We are so pleased that you have joined us tonight, and thank you for your support and continuing viewing of all our programs. If you visited the museum this summer, you will have seen and probably heard the Osprey family in the antenna tower. These amazing birds return year after year. Tonight's speaker, Mark Faherty, will share insights on the resurgence of the osprey population on the Cape. As a reminder, you can pose your questions during the program, and we'll get to as many at the end of the program as possible. If you hover your mouse over the Q&A icon at the bottom, you can type your question in the Q&A box. So it is my pleasure tonight to introduce tonight's speaker, Mark Faherty. Mark has been the science coordinator at Mass Audubon's Wellfleet Bay Wildlife Sanctuary since August 2007 and has led birding trips for Mass Audubon since 2002. While his current projects involve everything from oysters and horseshoe crabs to bats and butterflies, he has primarily studied bird ecology for the last 20 years. Working on research projects in Kenya and across the United States. He is past president of the Cape Cod Bird Club and current member of the Massachusetts Avian Records Committee. Weekly Bird Report, Mark's weekly essay on Cape and Islands bird life, airs each Wednesday on WCAI, the Cape and Islands NPR station. He also co-hosts Bird News, a monthly call-in show all about birds on WCI's The Point with Mindy Todd. Welcome, Mark, and it is my pleasure to turn the presentation over to you.
Thanks, Liz. Great to be here. That was a pretty slick video you guys had there. Gee, we don't have anything like that. I'm impressed.
Thank you.
All right, people still trickling in. I've been stalking the participants to see if I know anybody. I should. So I'm always happy to talk about Osprey, everybody's favorite raptor here on Cape Cod. I should probably have a more appropriate background than Tarangire National Park in Tanzania, but that's what I had the last time I Zoomed. So it's okay, you don't have to look at me for long. I'm gonna share my screen and get into my presentation. All right, so. How do I sound? Am I okay?
That looks good.
Looks good. I sound okay. I'm not.
Yep.
Okay, great. So this project has been around for a little more than 10 years in its current form. Although in recent years, it's gone a bit underground as I've had decreasing capacity to manage the data. But I am hoping to recruit some new volunteers tonight. I'm sure some of you, if you're here, you're interested in Osprey, you probably have some that you watch over the course of the summer. And so I am always looking for people who are willing to keep an eye on a nest. And I'll go over the data sheet and stuff like that eventually. And, you know, spy on it for me. That's why I call it voyeuristic citizen science. These birds they're just sort of out there. They're doing what they do in full view of everybody, everything they need to do to make babies and so on. And send me the information about how many chicks fledge, which is the data I'm most interested in. And I haven't had consistent data from Chatham over the last several years. So maybe there's somebody out there who can help fill in the gap. So here at Wellfleet Bay, I oversee a variety of projects. We do a lot in terms of local conservation issues, species focused, as well as larger scale focused projects, but species focused like our piping plover work, lease turns, as well. We're deep into that right now. Diamondback terrapins, state listed turtle that is very common here, thanks to our efforts, I think, and the efforts of Bob Prescott, our previous director over the years. We have tons of volunteers who help us with that project. Our sea turtle work, you might be familiar with, it tends to get a lot of press. That's mainly November, December, as cold stun sea turtles are washing in, and we partner with the New England Aquarium. They're washing in on Bayside beaches, and we partner with the New England Aquarium to get those guys up there as soon as possible. We do bird banding. See here in the lower left, the beautiful magnolia warbler. We do some public demonstrations around bird banding, and we have a few volunteers for that too. Horseshoe crab work. We've actually done some work for the town of Chatham on horseshoe crabs around the dredging projects, in addition to the work we've done at our own survey sites. This Osprey project has always kind of existed in the background. That wasn't the intention of putting it in the background. I just sort of thought of that now. Makes sense. But this project, it's not funded. I don't have a research tech, working on this. I really depend on volunteers sending me data, and then, finding some time in the fall to compile that data to get a picture of how ospreys are doing here on Cape Cod. And it's been increasingly challenging, but the work continues. Standing on the backs of giants, or the shoulders of giants, some of the big players in terms of studying and restoring the osprey populations here on Cape Cod, and I'll go over the trajectory of our populations in a minute, but Gil Fernandez sort of single-handedly almost brought back the population to the Westport River there in Bristol County, bringing birds up from New York, and bringing chicks and eggs up from New York and placing them in nests and that kind of thing, like really doing the hard work of bringing them back from the brink of local extinction to a healthy population. And then the academic side of that population, Alan Poole, a Falmouth guy at Cornell, PhD and career ornithologist, and he wrote the book and now has a new book out about ospreys, and is one of the global experts on the species, and is very much a local guy. Gus Ben David over on Martha's Vineyard, another person who almost by himself brought back that entire island's population by putting up poles. Pretty much all of the poles on Martha's Vineyard Gus put up. He's a retired now former Mass Audubon sanctuary director out there. And then Rob Beauregard, another researcher who also worked on the vineyard and has been best known lately for doing a lot of GPS satellite tagging of ospreys, and learning all kinds of cool things about how ospreys move around the planet. Very cool technology. The last time I gave this talk, I left some of these Falmouth slides in. I gave it for the 300 committee in Falmouth a few months ago. And Falmouth has so many ospreys, and there are a couple of guys, particularly this guy with the beard, Kevin Friel, is monitoring, I think, 116 osprey nests right now in Falmouth. And I'm hoping to get that data for him. I'm a little afraid it's scrawled into notebooks, but I'm hoping Kevin's a good guy and he's doing good work, and I hope to get that data. And then Chris Walls on the right from Mass Audubon has been helping a lot in Falmouth, putting up poles. That's just almost a crisis area for ospreys. And I'll kind of get into why a little bit later when I talk about power lines and Eversource. And so I'm looking for the Chatham version of Nancy McDonald here. Nancy's a Falmouth osprey volunteer of mine who monitors a whole bunch of nests. So I'm looking for my Kevin Friel, my Nancy McDonald for Chatham. Are you out there? Are you out there right now? Let's talk. So osprey's global distribution, zooming out a little bit here, or a lot. It's a global raptor. And I think that's the subtitle of Alan Poole's newest book, something like Conservation of a Global Raptor. And so you can see them in Africa, you can see them in South America, you can see them in Asia, you can see them in Alaska. I mean, they get around. You can see them in Australia. So they can be a familiar sight as you travel around the world. And this isn't even, I think, completely accurate anymore, as they've been expanding their population inland in various places, reclaiming areas they were extirpated from during the DDT years. This is a project called eBird. If you're a birder, you know what this is. This is a global real-time database of birdwatcher sightings, giving you another perspective on where people see ospreys, India, the Aleutian Islands, Europe, North and South America. The history of ospreys here in North America. So between the 50s and the 70s, the population here in the Northeast was reduced by 90% because of DDT. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this story. This is sort of the beginning of the modern environmental movement. The realization that DDT was thinning the eggshells of bald eagles and peregrine falcons and ospreys and brown pelicans. And Rachel Carson and the book Silent Spring, and the Endangered Species Act. So much was happening back then. These were heady times in the early environmental movement. And osprey studies helped get DDT banned, thanks to Roger Torrey Peterson working in Connecticut and making some discoveries, Rachel Carson, and a guy named Paul Spitzer also down there doing the work and figuring out what was happening with the eggshells and what the cause was, which was not easy. So if you've been around a long time on the Cape, you might remember when there weren't any ospreys. It wasn't that long ago. I mean, it's within my lifetime. So as of the 70s, there were maybe one or two pairs left somewhere, Falmouth, Mashpee, somewhere in that area. Banning of pesticides and people putting up nesting platforms importantly brought back the populations. Now, from one or two pairs then, it's well over 300, 500 pairs now on the Cape. I mean, I don't even know. I mean, there are new ones all the time, and we'll get into the population trajectory. Productivity is high relative to other populations around North America, and productivity is how many chicks they're producing, just doing their jobs as a species and replacing themselves in the population, and productivity is very high, and I'll get into why a little bit later. And so as this population grows, they're increasingly coming into conflict with people. As you guys know, they love artificial human structures, cell towers, Marconi towers, chimneys, telephone poles, all of these things. And it gets them into trouble. There's a turkey about 2 feet outside my window. Okay, so these are some slides I got from Rob Beauregard that do not include the Cape, but showing the population growing in southern New England after the banning of DDT starting in 1969 here. And these go in 10-year increments. So you see by 1979, they're starting to come back. They're moving inland a little bit and really filling in. They're on Nantucket again by 89. Filling in the Vineyard and the Westport River down there in southeastern Mass. 99, 2009. But you notice what's missing here is nothing from the Cape. And so when I started here at Wellfleet Bay around 2007, nobody was collecting data on what is the biggest osprey population, maybe in southern New England, which is here on the Cape. Certainly in Massachusetts. And so I started to recruit volunteers and try to do this in a more formal way and map the results, how many chicks fledged per pair and that sort of thing. Looking at this another way, this is a Mass Audubon project called the Breeding Bird Atlas. It was done 1975 to 1979, and then again in the 2000s. And so here's 75 to 79, and the green blocks are ospreys. So couple on the Cape, they were still on the Vineyard and the Westport River born, but really a shadow of their former range pre-DDT. But then by 2007 to 2011, big difference. They've really saturated the coast. They're moving inland increasingly. And 10 years later, this has only increased. Another way to look at that, just increasing all over the state. So why study them? As conservationists, we did our job, just, go home. They're saved. But there are a lot of reasons to continue with this work. I mean, first of all, people like them. They're big, they're obvious, they're easy for the average person to study. I mean, not always easy, but relatively easy compared to some little songbird in terms of nesting behavior. They're just out there to be watched. And this history of sensitivity to environmental change, from the DDT era, they've been deemed a sentinel species, right? So by keeping an eye on ospreys, and the fact that they're linked with the health of our coastal ecosystems. We're eating the same fish as them. We know that they're sensitive to pollution, and so probably a good idea to continue to keep an eye on ospreys for our own good. Here's one carrying a bluefish. I don't know whose photo that is. Very few of these photos, if any, are mine. Maybe one of these is mine. A lot of these come from volunteers of mine. Ospreys sort of get a pass. You probably remember when everyone hated cormorants, and then the seals have sort of taken the heat off of the cormorants, but somehow the ospreys just skate by eating stripers. And I've not heard anybody say they hate ospreys the way they hate cormorants and seals, but it's because they're pretty cool. People still like ospreys. This was from a volunteer of mine, Janet Dimitia. Speaking of hating cormorants, chasing a cormorant off of the nest platform. Get out of here. There are a lot of local authors. I already talked about Alan Poole and his first book here at the bottom. Another local author, David Gessner, has a couple of very popular books about ospreys that you might want to check out. Return of the Osprey is about watching a nest in Dennis. And then Soaring with Fidel is a kind of a funny book where he follows the migration of ospreys from Cape Cod to Cuba and beyond. And this was years ago when it wasn't so easy to get to Cuba. It's a good book. And then Alan Poole's new book, Ospreys, The Revival of a Global Raptor. That's what it is. And then Rob Beauregard's studies on satellite tracking, both juveniles and adults. His results have been incredibly interesting, and I'll get back to that. So the goals of my project was, first of all, to inventory and map the existing nests. This is a never-ending task because they're nesting in new places all the time. New telephone poles, new lights on Cape Cod League fields, et cetera, et cetera. Rocks, nesting on the ground in marshes, nesting on boat masts, docks, buoys. And so I certainly do not have anything close to an accurate inventory. I used to think I did, but not really anymore. And then use volunteers to monitor and collect productivity data that gives information on patterns of nest success or failure across the Cape. Are there areas where they're not doing well for some reason? What does that mean? For the most part, they do pretty well. One strange area where they don't seem to have filled in very much is Pleasant Bay, and I don't know why, other than there at Ryder Cove. There are relatively few occupied nests, like platforms up on some of the islands in Pleasant Bay that have not really attracted birds for whatever reason. I've never understood that. Meanwhile, they crowd themselves into Ryder Cove there. Identify gaps and good and bad nesting areas, because we get requests for, should we put in a new pole here or there? And then comparing with the other populations that are pretty well studied, like the Vineyard and the Westport River. So I have this data sheet that I developed, an old-fashioned paper data sheet. Most people fill it out electronically just in Microsoft Word and then just send it back to me, email it back to me. We need to have online data entry and get into this century. And so we've been working on that at Mass Audubon, trying to get the whole organization behind some sort of osprey project. And it's been challenging because different regions within Mass Audubon have completely different osprey projects with different approaches. So I might have to go rogue and just create my own for the Cape. We have instructions on the back and milestones to look for in their nesting biology. We ask people to look for the type of fish they're bringing back, and I'll get to that. There's only one person who really does that. And, are there nests that need repair? People tend to tell us that kind of thing anyway. That's one that's left over from the last one. And so people send me data, and, sometimes there's funny quotes in there where this former volunteer of mine, Kate Walls, was apparently unimpressed with the mating behaviors of the male osprey in this case. So it's always fun to read people's comments on the data sheets. Oh, and then Don Henderson lives on Lewis Bay the sort of the Yarmouth side of Hyannis Harbor there. And the nest is right outside his house. And he gives me an unbelievable amount of data. It's really amazing on this one nest. And it is kind of like Rear Window, 11 pages. And I think I'll get to some of his data later. Most overwatched nest is the Shaw's Walmart in, is it Falmouth or Mashpee? It's just like on a light. It was on a light. I think they moved it to a pole in the Walmart and Shaw's parking lot there. And so everybody goes there. So everybody reports on this one nest. Housekeeping. There are cameras on some nests. This is Barnstable High School. And this was kind of a funny one. Ospreys are pack rats. And so if you ever look inside a nest, they're kind of gross. They're like hoarders. And so this one had like a whisk broom in it, some trash. There was a nest that had a fishing pole hanging from it. Like they brought it back to the nest like it was stick, and the fishing pole ended up hanging from the nest by a hook. So they're definitely pack rats. There was an old T-shirt that was in a nest one time that we used to pass around as an award, as a joke award to the volunteers. But they're very much pack rats. Sometimes they tend gardens in their nests. So here's some actual shrubberies growing in a nest. It developed a soil layer. So humble beginnings back in 2007, we were just kind of looking at a few nests out here on the Outer Cape. And then 2009 was a good year. I actually had an intern, an AmeriCorps intern who was very good with GIS and went around the Cape and checked on nests. We had very, very good data for 2009. And this shows you kind of the goal here, patterns. I mean, this was 12 years ago, obviously, but patterns of nest success. And so the size and color of the dot tells you how many chicks they fledged. And so you can see that, 2 is pretty typical, a lot of yellow dots. This year, there were a lot of 3 chicks, nests that fledged 3 chicks, which is pretty good. That's well above average. Not many nests that didn't produce any. These turkeys keep harassing me here. And the very rare 4 chicks fledged nest here in Bourne. That doesn't happen very often. And that really depends on the fishing prowess of the male. So there was a real stud male there who was good at fishing. And because the male pretty much has to do all of the fishing most of the time, the female stays at the nest and does the incubating and the nest protection and the brooding of the young. And then the male brings them all the fish. And so if the male is a good fisherman, then they tend to have good productivity. And if not, not so much. A few years later. So the number of volunteers I've had has sort of waned. I had somebody who used to monitor 60 nests in Falmouth. But they passed away, and then so it's completely dependent on volunteer effort, and so I am always looking for new. So here's the distribution, just the distribution of nests across the Cape here, and you can see that like Truro. This isn't accurate. There are I think at least 2 cell phone tower nests in Truro now that are not on here, and I don't know of any in Provincetown, but by now there might be one. But they really taper off as you get out here to the Outer Cape. And this is not completely accurate. The growth industry or the growth sector of the Osprey real estate market right now is Orleans and Eastham. And they're just, they're like mosquitoes all of a sudden over the last few years in this area. And so we're starting to see that growth, they're sort of saturated other places. And so we're starting to see more growth out here. The productivity is just really high. And again, I'll get to that. So there's no way this is accurate. I just added one a few minutes ago here that I hadn't had mapped previously. But you may be looking at this and realizing there are nests that are not on here that you know about. And so I don't think I put a slide with my contact info, but I'll do that at the end. But yeah, this is Chatham here. And so still room for growth, I think, here. There's probably room for some other poles. We don't have a lot of capacity for putting up new poles, but it is something we can do on a limited basis. Mostly I'm interested in the data on existing poles. You know, are they successful? Are they being used? And if they're being used, are they successful? Are they hatching and ultimately fledging chicks? And if so, how many? And it's not that easy because people get busy in July and that's when they're fledging. July is when your grandkids are coming. July is you have company, you're doing stuff, you know, maybe you're going to Maine or whatever. So it is a little bit harder than it seems, but it's certainly very doable. So this shows the annual productivity summed across years here is 1.59. So that means on average, an osprey nest, an occupied osprey nest on the Cape produces 1.59 chicks. In wildlife population biology terms, that's very high because they live a long time. This isn't some, you know, this isn't the robins in your backyard that live 5 years. This is a bird that might live 25 years. So if they're producing 1.5 chicks a year for 25 years, you know, unless a lot of those are dying during the winter, then, you know, we've got a lot of ospreys around. I think a natural productivity level would be much lower than that. This is an unnaturally high level of chicks being fledged because they're nesting on human structures with unnaturally low predation rates, meaning raccoons aren't getting up there on those platforms because they're not in trees anymore. I mean, historically, obviously, they were only nesting in trees. And now they're almost only nesting on human structures where they're very safe from pretty much everything except great horned owls. That's the one thing that can completely derail. A great horned owl can take fully grown osprey chicks right out of a nest one by one, carry them off. They're a formidable predator that has every advantage during the nighttime hours. But again, the point here, ospreys aren't going anywhere. The population is still going way up here. And so we need to figure out some of these human conflicts. Town by town, you can see some of the very productive towns here. Falmouth, certainly, Barnstable, Bourne, Sandwich, quite a few, Yarmouth. As of a few years ago, 1,800 plus chicks fledged, and those are only the ones we know about. That's a fraction of the actual total. So a lot of osprey chicks being put out into the world, but then they have to fly to South America, survive 1.5 years in South America, make it back here 2 years after they were born, secure a nest site in a very tight real estate market where the adults don't want them around and will fight them. It's probably only in their 3rd or 4th year that they're actually securing a nest and starting to successfully breed. And so, you know, they have some opportunities to drop out of the population over the first few years, which probably, if something like 60% of them weren't dying in the first year, you know, we would just be, ospreys would be like mosquitoes on Cape Cod. So I estimated that's about 400 new adults recruited into the population over those years. Oh, I'm sorry, more like 150. This was, I put photos in now and again because they're a lot more interesting than a table or a graph. And this was one of the rare nests that fledged 4 chicks. This was that nest in Bourne. You can see 4. So the chicks, people often don't know how to tell them from the adults. The adults are just sort of like pure dark brown on the back. And the chicks have this very scalloped, you can't see it that well here, but the chicks are paler with this like pale edgings on all the feathers. I'll have a better pic of a chick later on. This was a graph I made a few years ago, just kind of fitting a model to what I knew about the population in 1970 and my estimate of what it was about 5 years ago. And you can see basically exponential population growth over that time because of that very high productivity. But again, this was just my guess, but it turned out it was a pretty good guess. This is actual breeding bird survey data for Massachusetts over that same time period. And it is in fact exponential growth. Here's probably the only photo in this presentation that I took. This was in Belize. This was the resident Caribbean subspecies of osprey that has a very pale head that just stays in the Caribbean, because why would you leave the Caribbean if you live in the Caribbean? While I was taking this picture, somebody was taking my wallet out of my backpack around the corner. I always think of that when I see that photo. The Martha's Vineyard population has been very well studied, and same time period, about 1970, you have Gus Ben David putting up poles in the blue line here, and the occupancy of those poles, the number of pairs, sort of tracking that, and then plateauing during the 90s. And so they seem to be mostly at capacity out there. I think they might be up to 80 though now. To check. Anyway, this idea of carrying capacity is something. What I don't need to get into that. All right. We have more of a discussion later on, so maybe I'll try to speed this up a bit. So I referenced Don Henderson. This is the guy that sends me 11 pages of data on his one osprey nest that he can see from his house. And so we know what date the male returned, and the female comes 2 days later. That's pretty standard for ospreys. The males are very motivated to reclaim their nest and defend it, so they come back earlier. That's true of a lot of birds. First, when the first egg was laid, watched fox and deer playing together on his lawn on May 4th. He lives in a Disney film, apparently. A chick falls out of the nest. Don puts it back. I mean, this is just like his nest. And then the species of fish cod, herring, bluefish, striped bass. It's mainly scup. If you know Lewis Bay, Hyannis Harbor, it's just full of scup, and that's mainly what he sees them bring in. But he's seen some pretty cool things: sea robins, needlefish. And I actually can't see the bottom of my own screen. I don't know if, yeah. I wish I had more of this data from people. It's really interesting to see what kind of fish they're bringing back. And he had this story of, in 1 year, he had this story where the osprey brought something round back to the nest that looked like a ball. And then it sort of fell out of the nest and bounced on the ground, and he goes up to it, and it's a puffer fish. It was a blown up puffer fish that had somehow not been punctured, and he picked it up and put it back in the water, and it swam away. So that was a fish that had a story to tell. I mean, they can catch all kinds of things. Look at the size of this flounder. Flounder will come into fairly shallow water, presenting a big old target for osprey talons. I don't think it's that uncommon for them to take big flounder. Nest types, overwhelmingly platforms, about 60% those platforms that people put up, mostly out in a salt marsh or on a little barrier beach. But all kinds of others. Utility poles is certainly a growth sector. Tree. I think there are a lot of tree nests we don't know about, but they're still relatively rare for this bird to nest in an actual tree. Ospreys are one of these species that have just basically hitched their wagon to us. Others include chimney swifts, a little insectivorous bird that only nests in chimneys anymore, as far as we know. Purple martins in the eastern US only nest in human-provided birdhouses now in the entire eastern US. So some of these species are just like, we're with you guys, and ospreys have become that in the eastern US to a large extent. If you go to Scotland, in part, I think because of egg collecting continuing as an illicit hobby there, they are very much a bird of wilderness still, like nesting in tall trees in some remote loch, but not, you know, nesting on a buoy in a busy harbor or on somebody's dock the way they do here. So it's interesting that they can be a very different bird in different parts of the world. I think the light towers at the Cape Cod League fields are another big growth sector. I can't imagine there are too many fields left that don't have an osprey nest on one of the light poles anymore. In Hyannis, it was one of the first ones, and they put a platform, I don't know, about 3 feet above the lights where they had been nesting, and moved the nest up there, and it's worked very well. I don't know if any other fields have followed suit. I know they're at Veterans. I, up until last year, played in an over 40 men's baseball league and loved playing in Veterans Field. And I know there has been a nest there in recent years, but I don't know how it's been doing, so I don't get down there anymore. This was in Ryder Cove several years ago. If you know, don't use your fishing boat for a while, you might come back and find an osprey nest on it. Technically, once it gets to this stage, or it looks like it's clearly being incubated, you can see this little black and white thing is the head of the female incubating the nest. And so that means you would need a federal depredation permit under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act to actually remove that. And I'm pretty sure the fishermen didn't get one. The nest was not there when it was time to go fishing. But that's about what you'd expect. This was just one of the ones in Falmouth. There's so many stories like this. And so the typical thing that Eversource does, and for some reason there are several in Chatham where Eversource has not done anything. They have let the ospreys nest on the pole. I'm thinking of the one that was at the corner as you're going out to the Morris Island Causeway, that was at that sharp corner for years, and eventually caught on fire. Eventually the ones that are on poles like this do catch on fire. Maybe not this year, but somewhere down the line. And so that's why they take them down and they put up these deterrents. The problem is the ospreys are very determined, and they will just nest on another pole, or they'll try to add sticks to this, and the sticks will end up on the wires and cause a short circuit or a fire. And so this is not a good solution if you don't give them an alternative place to nest. When they have given them another pole with a platform on it that they can move to, it works. It stops fires and outages and dead ospreys. They are reluctant to do that. They're pretty clear about this because they don't want to encourage more ospreys nesting on and near their equipment, and they basically don't want to be putting more ospreys into the world that are then going to nest on their equipment. So they just sort of rip down the nest, put up a deterrent, and say a few Hail Marys. I mean, there's no real strategy there. And the ospreys invariably end up on another pole. And this is something that I've been kind of pushing this with Eversource. We've been having increasingly high-level meetings with them, we being Mass Audubon folks here on the Cape, and then wildlife rehabbers like the folks from Cape Wildlife Center and also Wildcare, because they end up with the birds from the nests that catch on fire. They end up with the chicks and things, and they end up working to get chicks back in the nests. They get volunteers to do that, and tree companies help with that, and local conservation departments. And so those rehabbers are on the front lines of this issue too, more so than me even. And we're seeing some positive signs, but they need a plan. I think this is going to be kind of a long slog to get them to change their practices. They really do not want to put up alternative places for them to nest. The guy in charge literally says, well, they need to start nesting in trees. You know, like they're gonna get the memo and just start doing that. It just doesn't work that way. They nest on human structures. We've been programming them to do that since the colonial era, when they would put up wagon wheels for ospreys to nest on top of a pole, hoping that the ospreys would keep away the red-tailed hawks that eat their chickens. So we've been training ospreys for this for a long time, and we created a electrical infrastructure that looks like a whole bunch of osprey platforms. And so they need to develop a plan to retrofit these, especially these double beam pole tops that are often at the end of a line, so that they are not an attractive nuisance anymore. And so, you know, there are solutions, and I think states further south, utilities further south, have been more willing to put up alternative places for them to nest, like this kind of thing. because you end up with sad things like this. I mean, it's not good for Eversource. It's outages. It's dead birds, and so it's something that we need to fix. And so there is a huge document that have been sending to them over the last like 6 years or something like that. Like, hey, you guys know about this document? You signed it back in 2006, but you don't seem to be following it. So anyway, we're working on it. This is a better story. This is the osprey in Eastham, young osprey, that working with Rob Beauregard was satellite tagged several years back. And a little bit of a window into that process here. So Rob is very experienced with this. So you can see the scalloped feathers here, the white tips on the feathers. That tells you it's a young bird. This is true across bird groups. This is true of shorebirds and many songbirds. And if you see a bird this time of year with fresh looking feathers with crisp white tips, it's probably a young of the year. And so he puts on a falconer's hood and fits this solar powered GPS transmitter, and this is several years ago. They've gotten smaller now, and they're able to put these on smaller and smaller birds. It's like microchip technology. It just keeps getting smaller and smaller, and they're putting them on shorebirds and things now. And so this bird, we let this bird go, and then we got, it's addictive. It's an addictive way to study birds because you're getting real-time data on where that bird is on the planet every day. And so this young osprey eventually, after hanging around on the Cape for a while, migrated, went up to Peaktown, over to the mainland, up to New Hampshire, hung out on the Connecticut River, probably eating some herring or something, and then down to the Delaware River eventually, and really just sort of imprinted on rivers, this osprey, once she got to the mainland. Then went up the Delaware River, up to this obscure river in middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania, the Lackawaxen River. Spent a month up there, visited the Hudson River once during this time, and then eventually, finally, did a normal migration. And by November 6th, after being in Pennsylvania in mid-October, by November 6th was in Venezuela. And a very typical osprey migration down the coast, hit the Carolinas and then out over the ocean, lost track of her for a little bit, and it was scary, but then she made it to Cuba. Most ospreys migrate through Cuba. It's the only place where you can see flocks of ospreys in migration. And then through across Hispaniola and then down to Venezuela, and then acted like she was going to hang there for a while. And I lost track of Goody. I sort of stopped keeping track. I figured she was going to be there for the next 18 months. But then one day she up and flew, and Rob emailed me, did you see what Goody did? And I had not. And Goody had flown 800 miles deeper into heart of darkness, Amazonia in Brazil. And it looked like this. When you zoom in, I love Google Earth, you can zoom into these remote parts of the world and feel good that there is still absolute wilderness out there in places. These are just little tributaries of the Amazon. And this is where she made her last stand. And our last records of Goody were in mid-December, somewhere in just the absolute nowhere jungles of Brazil. And so, the story I tell is that, well, she was a river osprey and she was looking for the biggest river of all, the Amazon. And maybe she got there. Maybe the transmitter fell off or it failed. Who knows? Or maybe she got on the wrong side of a harpy eagle. We'll never know. But we learned things from Goody. She traveled 4,247 miles over 31 days. Averaging 134 miles per day. The young ones are not very, picture a toddler getting somewhere. They sort of wander around and they're exploring and going over there. And so that's how young ospreys are. Adults, when you track them, are very direct. They just go straight to the wintering grounds. And they think that this exploration has some sort of value to them where they're learning the larger landscape. and where resources are in case they need to find better fishing grounds at some point in the future. Here's putting up a pole with AmeriCorps and what that looks like. We used to use old telephone poles. Now we're moving towards like 6x6 lumber. Back then we were using primitive tools. This was one just north of Bridge Road in Chatham. And I'm still not sure if that one ever got occupied. I was surprised that it didn't. Chatham is a little bit funny in terms of how some nests don't get occupied. Sort of like Iwo Jima here. And then, so you use these sturdy ropes to get this thing up and put these struts in the ground. Very, very sturdy. These tend to last a long time. The current status of my project, I'm still accepting data at pole locations and new volunteers in select areas, especially people willing to monitor more than one nest, like bundlers, looking for bundlers. But even if you're just looking, if you just have one nest, increasingly having to figure out what to do with requests to put up poles. We definitely have some capacity issues there. I think we've discussed this internally and come up with like a cost structure for doing this so that we can continue to do a few of these in the future. But most of my time now is figuring out these Eversource problem nests and meeting with Eversource about fixing that issue. And then also discussing a statewide project with my colleagues here at Mass Audubon and trying to figure out some sort of a data entry, online data entry via a website. And this is another growth industry, keep referencing these growth sectors, and that's bald eagles. And so, where was this? Was Harwich, I want to say. This was one of my volunteers. And so it used to be someone would say, oh, I think I saw an eagle on an osprey nest. And it was like, yeah, right. But now it's probably pretty likely. And so the eagles start nesting in February. So they have a crack at an osprey nest for a month and a half sometimes before ospreys come back. And so I was lucky to be invited to the banding of bald eagle chicks in Bourne, in sort of cranberry country in Bourne. In an osprey nest like this along some power lines that was an eagle nest. They took it over and apparently kicked out the ospreys. Often when the eagles try to do this, the ospreys come back and are absolutely vicious and tenacious and successfully drive away the bald eagles, who are probably often young eagles. Eagles that are occupying a new site are often first-time nesters. So maybe don't put up as much of a fight, or maybe didn't even have eggs. But I think this is something we'll see playing out more and more now that bald eagles are nesting on Cape Cod. I definitely in sort of the Marston Mills area, there's been a nest for a couple of years. They've attempted in Brewster. I suspect there's a nest somewhere around the pond complex in Harwich, Brewster that we don't know about, Mashpee, Wakeby Pond. And I think there will be more. So keep an eye out for this. Acknowledgements. Some baby ospreys, babies only a mother could love. People that helped over the years. All right, so I think we can go into the Q&A. I'm not sure what should I stop sharing or?
Yep, just stop sharing, and we're already getting some questions in. And thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. You mentioned that the ospreys are determined, and they certainly are, because in early spring we see them come and start their nest, and then the nor'easter comes along and blows it away, and then they rebuild it, and they keep rebuilding it until they have a nest. So how do they pick their nest sites, Mark? And it looks like they come back every year. So is that common?
Yeah. I'm gonna try to turn on a light here. I look like one of those interviews where there's somebody that 60 minutes interview with somebody who doesn't want to be identified.
And to the audience, just remember you can type your questions in the little Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we will get to as many questions as possible.
Great, we've got blinky lights.
That looks better.
Yeah, the lights are sort of blinking on and off. So it's a good question. In the discussions with Eversource, the guy in charge of the overhead lines was saying that, well, once they nest on power lines, they'll always nest on power lines. There's no evidence for that. They're just opportunistic. I mean, they need to find somewhere to nest. And they're not super picky. Once the density gets to a certain point, you know, we see where they're all of the different structures they're nesting on, and rocks, and sometimes on the ground when they get desperate. Ideally, they're looking for a place where they're not going to be threatened by predators like great horned owls. And I think great horned owls will sometimes spook them away from a particular area. We have a nesting pole that has never had a nest on it here at the sanctuary. It's like one of the most beautiful pieces of real estate on Cape Cod. Is the top of our hill here overlooking our marshes and Cape Cod Bay, commanding view. It's one of the nicest views on the Outer Cape, I think. And it's never had an osprey nest on it. And we do have great horned owls that nest in the woods behind it. And that's been the theory. I think those owls like to perch on it at night. But yeah, I think they're just looking for somewhere that feels safe. And they're willing to fly good distances. They will often fish, you know, we think of them as, you know, they're nesting coastally, but they'll often fish in the ponds, communal, like certain ponds will be a communal fishing grounds. Certainly any of the ponds with a herring run, you'll have multiple pairs of ospreys, multiple individuals using those ponds. And so it doesn't have to be that close to one of them. And I think that's why we have so many nests. They're not picky.
Okay, thanks. You mentioned great horned owls are there as a natural predator. Do they have other natural predators? And then second part of that question is, what do you think is the greatest threat to them?
Right now, nothing. I mean, just the way the population is growing, I think they need more threats. I think the population is getting to unnatural levels because they're able to produce chicks at such a high rate on these artificial structures. I mean, nothing is getting to them when they're on cell phone towers and that kind of a thing. I'm trying to think, you know, I don't even think of them anymore in terms of threats, right? They're not declining, they're increasing. And so it's, you know, it's an interesting way to think about it. I mean, so many things, we're so used to it. Conservation is talking about some species that's declining. And so it's very easy to talk about what the threats are. But yeah, not much.
Okay, thank you. So it's sort of a good news story.
Oh, yeah.
Stuart has a question. I think it was on one of your graphs that you showed that the population dipped in 2017. Do you have some explanation for that?
Hi, Stu. I banded the final martin chicks today, just so you know. They're still doing great. Gourd 20. So that's not the right interpretation. I'm sorry, I didn't explain that graph or that table very well. That was all very much a function of how many volunteers I had that given year. It was not. That's not an accurate representation of what was happening. That's why I stick with the average productivity data, because that's averaged and is less sensitive to how many volunteers I have in any given year. The population has not decreased at all. It's been going up every single year. It's just a matter of how many nests I receive data on in any given year. And in 2017, I didn't get very many. The sharp drop off was probably when the woman who monitored 60 nests for me passed away. I can't remember exactly what year that was.
Okay.
Nests for television monitoring, right. There used to be one at Woods Hole that was the subject of great controversy about eight or 9 years ago. And that was one where the female became abusive to her own chicks. The female osprey was withholding food, was physically like attacking them. And people were like, you do something, intervene, Mass Audubon, do something. It had nothing, we weren't involved at all. And people were blaming us for, it was just a very strange situation. And people were coming to me and to Rob Beauregard and to Alan Poole, what do we do? The person in charge of the cameras. It ended up being a story on This American Life on NPR, if you're familiar with that show, about internet communities and people shouting at each other. But I think eventually they did turn that one off because it became so contentious. I'm trying to think of other ones. Some of them are closed circuit, like the Barnstable High School one, and there are some private ones that are closed circuit. I'm trying to think of if there are others that are publicly available on the web. I should look into that. That's a good question.
Thanks. We have a question from Melissa. Do they actually push babies out of the nest if there's no room? Wonder how many fall out as they try to leave. We did have a little incident here where it looked like it was a baby bird that was on the ground.
Yeah. No, that happens quite a bit. I mean, after storms and yeah, baby birds fall out of nests, and osprey are no different in that regard. Whether it's siblicide, I mean, that might happen. We've seen examples of a runt you would think would be ripe for siblicide catching up. And that was one of the Don Henderson nest years where he's able to just watch these guys so closely that he saw the runt of the brood catch up. You know, the male was able to bring in enough fish and fledge just as strongly as the other two. There may be some siblicide. It certainly does happen in raptor populations, but it's often not clear what has happened when they end up under nests. But sometimes it is storm related.
Okay.
They go to the same nest year after year. They're long lived. They mate for life, and they will come back to the same nest site year after year. They don't mourn if one member of the pair doesn't make it back from the wintering grounds. They'll have a new mate 10 minutes later, but they do tend to live a long time. Once they get to be an adult, their annual survival is very, very high, and they do. So you are probably seeing the same pair for many years at a time coming back to the same nest.
Thank you, Mark. So we're just about out of times, and I would like to thank you again for joining us tonight. It was a very informative and fascinating presentation. And we will be sending you this Chatham Marconi Maritime hat so that you can wear it when you're out in the field or wherever you might go. So we appreciate that. We'd like to invite our viewers to all come and see our ospreys who are still in the nest, and as well as to take a look at, we have an outside exhibit that explains some of the habits and the characteristics of these birds. So we have a few more weeks before they leave, right, Mark?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, they'll be around into September, and sometimes a male will have to stay into September with a chick that hasn't quite figured things out yet. And then you'll get migrants coming through into October. And increasingly, there are records into December sometimes now.
Okay, so we have some time, so please come and see us. Just would like to also invite you to our next virtual presentation, which is August 26th, and we'll have members of the Coast Guard who deploy when EPIRBs go off, which might be of interest to our boaters out there. So again, thank you, Mark, and thank you all in the audience for participating tonight. Good night.
Thank you.